Welcome all of you to our presentation on FERPA for Student Affairs Professionals. I'm glad to see so many of you and meet people from across NSHE at this virtual summit. I am Sam Fugazzotto. I'm the registrar at UNLV, and I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague Chelsea Peoples, who serves as one of the assistant registrars here at UNLV as well. I give Chelsea, first of all of the credit for this presentation. She is our campus's FERPA trainer-in-chief, essentially, and she talks about FERPA all the time with groups like this, folks who don't necessarily need to have FERPA at their fingertips, but who need to know about it in their work, because frankly, we all deal with student information. It's a very important and timely topic. So she's adapted this for kind of a broader NSHE audience, not so specific to UNLV campus specifically. My role as it pertains to FERPA centers on things like FERPA investigations and overall compliance. So basically, if you don't listen to Chelsea, you get to deal with me for an investigation. So we have, I think, a pretty good, like good cop, bad cop perspective on this topic. And I think we can kind of approach it from both angles as we talk to you all today. So let me try to advance slides here, which I'm not able to. Here we go. Sorry about that. So this is a basic overview of our presentation. We're going to introduce some technical lingo that may or may not be super familiar to you, but we really intend for the presentation to be for, like I said, folks like all of you who work with student information on a daily basis, but you don't necessarily need to have FERPA at your fingertips. So if we get a little bit too jargony, feel free to ask questions, as Megan had said in the chat, privately to her or to everyone, and we'll do our best to answer all of them in our time together today. I'm going to take us through the first three topics. I will talk about FERPA, also known as the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. We'll talk about student rights under FERPA. And then we'll talk about what education records are. We'll actually spend quite a bit of time talking about that because it can be a little bit of a confusing topic under FERPA. Then for the final three topics, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea to talk about parent and third-party rights, suggestions for all of us really as faculty and staff, and then a very timely topic, FERPA and COVID. I'll give you a hint, it still applies under COVID, but Chelsea will talk in a little bit more detail about that. Okay. So FERPA isn't old at this point. It was enacted in 1974. And actually, as I was reading over my notes, I was in my office this morning and I brought out, this is I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's not going to come through very well, but I have the original ACRO, which is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, a 1976 guide to FERPA when FERPA was, brand spanking new as a piece of recently enacted legislation. It was sent to the first registrar of UNLV, Muriel M. Parks, who I think no longer is living, and never met her. But it was interesting as I was preparing that I stumbled across this. It was fortuitous, I would say. But the bottom line is, it is a law that's been on the books for a long time. We've all had to live with it for a long time. And there's been a lot of guidance that's come out since 1974 for sure. All of that said, in spite of all the technicalities and all of the guidance that the Department of Education has come up with since 1974, this is just Sam talking. I think that a lot of FERPA boils down to common sense, all right? So what I would encourage you to do in your practice and when you are doing your own jobs, put yourself in the position of a student whose information might be disclosed. And a number of you probably are students, or I mean, certainly you've been students. If you're attending school A and school A randomly decides, well, I'm going to send Sam's grades and test scores and his class schedule, where he is on Tuesday mornings for class, out to anyone just because they ask. If that feels like it's not quite right, there is a good chance that it's a FERPA violation. So just keep that in mind. Your gut is not necessarily the worst guide for dealing with FERPA. It's not your only guide. There are, as I said, there are a lot of technicalities, and I encourage you to reach out to someone, give them a call if you have questions about those technicalities, but your gut is not a bad guide. So any educational institution, which is all of us and most of the other higher education institutions in the US, receive funds from the Department of Education via federal financial aid and others. But basically, the Department of Education has the purse strings. And even though, in my knowledge, no school has ever lost access to federal financial aid funding since 1974. The possibility is out there, and the Department of Education will hold institutions accountable for FERPA violations. In turn, what that means for all of us as employees is that we will be held accountable for our behavior for possible FERPA violations. So, for example, when I do FERPA investigations, after contacting a person who has allegedly violated FERPA, the second person I contact in many cases is that person's supervisor. And the expectation often is, if I find that a FERPA violation occurred, is I will ask the supervisor to get involved and ensure that the person has training and, takes measures to ensure that the violation doesn't happen again. Okay, so these are the basic rights that are granted to eligible students, and I'll talk about what an eligible student is in a second. They have the right to access their education records. In many cases, you know about transcripts, and I think probably in 99% of the cases of students wanting to access their records, it's either through a routine transcript request or a student just nowadays, especially seeing their own information in, say, Canvas or some other LMS or in whatever the student information system is at their institution. But if they file an official request for records, like let's say I went to, back to my alma mater and I wanted to see my old file, I'm not entitled to show up in the registrar's office with my ID and expect them to, flop over my file from my student days. What it often means is the school has, if it's a full review of a student's file, a school usually takes like 45 days to respond. That's certainly one of the things that I would do when I get an official request for a student to access their records. Certainly, those of you who are not in the registrar's office, and I scrolled through the names, I don't recognize any of the folks that I know in other campus registrar's offices. If you in your office get a request for access to records, punt it over to your registrar. I mean, not to volunteer my colleagues, but that's what we're here for, and we will be glad to help you, and as well as to answer any of the more technical questions that you might have about FERPA. Another key right under FERPA is the right of students, eligible students, to have their records amended. That is to deal with inaccurate or incorrect information. It's not to deal with substantive changes like, I got an A- and I think I should get an A. That's considered a separate thing under FERPA. The third big right is the right to have control over the disclosure of personally identifiable information from the records, except in certain circumstances. We'll talk about that, but what that often means is that you'll need to get student consent before you release records to a third party in many cases. And the final thing, again, is where I come in, the right to, as an investigator, the right to file a complaint with the Department of Education regarding an alleged violation. So when I do an investigation, what I do is I maintain pretty meticulous case notes on whatever happened. I talk about who allegedly violated FERPA, what happened, whose records were breached or disclosed, as well as what the corrective measures are by the institution. I do all of that in the off chance, or maybe not so off chance, that the person whose rights were violated or whose information was disclosed goes to the Department of Education and files a complaint. That actually happened once in my time at UNLV, and it was kind of a special case for many reasons. But we do, at UNLV, keep pretty good case notes on what happened, just in the chance that something happens with the Department of Education and we need to justify our actions. When do FERPA rights begin? FERPA rights begin when a student enrolls in a higher education institution, and that's often the first day of the individual's first term of enrollment. So if they're gone for 2 years and they come back 2 years later or whatever, we would still consider their rights to have begun at the start of their first term. At UNLV, we actually define it as first day of first term of enrollment, or when the student moves into our res life facilities, whichever comes first. And then it's also, we treat a student as an eligible student when they reach 18 years of age or when they attend a post-secondary institution. So at UNLV and others, and I think it's defined this way under Board of Regents policy, student has FERPA rights regardless of age at any of our campuses because they are in attendance at a post-secondary institution by coming to an NSHE institution. When do FERPA rights end? They end with the end of the person's life, really. But this is an important point Just because a person stops attending or stops your institution does not mean their FERPA rights cease so long as they're alive. So I would expect even though I'm a student of life, but even though I'm no longer a formal student at any of my alma maters, I would expect them to comply with FERPA and not to play fast and loose with my information. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Like, oh yeah, I got a stack of transcripts on my desk, but all these people graduated 10 years ago. So it's not a FERPA violation if, I just leave them out all the time for anyone to see. Wrong. You need to put things like that away or keep them as secure as you would as if those students were in attendance today. Another thing to keep in mind is I dealt with this more at a previous institution where I served, but FERPA does stop applying upon death of an individual. That said, I can give you 6 ways from Sunday for you not to just play fast and loose with the records of deceased students. And we can talk about specific questions about that, but generally speaking, you want to be judicious, even if a person is deceased and technically no longer has FERPA rights. This is kind of a $1 million question. What is an education record? Well, it's any recorded information directly related to a student that's maintained by the university or college or any party acting on behalf of the university. So it's a pretty expansive definition of what a record is. Basically, if you as a school official keep information on a student that could be shared with others, you are keeping an education record. And I think Chelsea will talk more about this, but a big exception is a sole possession record. And what that really is we all probably have them in various forms. I mean, I used to, back when writing on paper was more of a thing, I would keep a notebook of phone calls I received, or if I got a voicemail, I would take notes that Chelsea Peoples called me and here's a number. And then if it was, an in-depth conversation, I would try to take some notes. That would count typically as a sole possession record if I'm just using it as a memory jogger for myself. But if it's a book that is somehow placed in an official file of a student that could be shared by other school officials, then it becomes an education record. Medium is something also that's important to keep in mind. It doesn't matter if it's a piece of paper in on your desk or in a notebook, in PeopleSoft or whatever student information system you happen to be using, or a personal Google Drive. It often Medium. FERPA is agnostic to Medium, basically. Another thing to keep in mind, and I guess it's a technicality, but we could talk about it a little bit. It has to be personally traceable back to an individual student. So if I say UNLV offers a course called English 101, that is not a FERPA violation because there's no, even though, ENG 101 could appear on a student's transcript, just saying that we have the course or that we disclose information about the course is not a FERPA violation because there is no student information attached to it. However, if I take English 101 offered Tuesdays and Thursdays starting at 10 in the morning on student A's schedule, and I just randomly release that, that would be a FERPA violation because student A is involved. So just remember that it has to be traceable back to a student for it to count as a part of an education record and therefore subject to FERPA. Oh, let me advance the slide here. Information in the record. So basically any information related to the student, which is what I just said, it's considered part of the education record. There are 2 big types of information under FERPA. There's the more public facing or directory information, and there is non-directory, which is more private. I'm going to talk about that distinction a little bit more on the next slide. As institutions, we can all use discretion when we determine whether or not we want to share directory information with a third party. So directory information could be, you get a phone call you want to verify the dates of attendance for student B. Well, technically, unless the student opted out of directory information release, you could release that, you may release that, but may becomes a key word in FERPA jargon, because even though we may do something doesn't mean we're obligated to. And I think in many cases, this becomes a good time for you to use that gut check. You're not, if you get a call from someone who's just randomly asking for student B's information or whatever it is, and something doesn't seem right, I think that there is a good case for you to at least pick up the phone and call your registrar, or maybe call your legal counsel, because you're not obligated to give that information out. And there are even if you're just releasing directory information, as you can imagine, there are a lot of things that could go wrong with that. So I would encourage you, if you get calls like that, to talk it up with someone who may be a little bit more familiar with FERPA or deal with cases like that more than you are. So here is a listing, not meant to be exclusive necessarily, but of examples of directory and non-directory information elements from a student education record. Basically, FERPA gives institutions a menu of data elements that are eligible to be considered directory information. So, you know, it could be obviously name, address, email, things like that, degrees earned. Institutions can choose from within that menu. So one school may decide to say that degrees earned are part of their directory information definition, but their, you know, their competitor or the other school across the street from them may decide that degrees earned are not part of directory information. So that's perfectly legitimate under FERPA. What institutions can't do is say, well, you know, we're just going to define race and ethnicity and social security number as directory information. That way we can release all of the social security numbers and the ethnic backgrounds of our students to third parties without permission. No, you can't do that under FERPA. There are pretty clear guidelines on that. So you can't, just because you wish it were directory information doesn't make it so. Generally, directory information, if you think of it, I think the term probably comes from when printed directories were more of a thing, when the guidebook that I tried to show you was actually current 40 plus years ago. But typically it's information that's not considered harmful if it's released to a third party without consent of the student. That said, as I mentioned, there are many instances where releasing something like an address or an email address or a phone number could be harmful to a student. That's when you want to be judicious and talk to people before you just give information like that out. Other examples of education records: computer printout in your office, class roster on your desktop, notes taken during an advising session. And advising session, we mean here in broad terms. We all kind of advise students in various ways on policies, procedures, even if it's not formal academic advisement. And the exceptions here really are the one thing that I'm thinking of are sole possession records that I mentioned. But if they are notes that could be shareable, for example, at UNLV, we have Campus Connect, right? So if we have a student named Chelsea who sees her advisor, someone in her advising center, that advisor will take notes that in theory could be shared in the system with another advisor. And I was dealing with a formal records request yesterday that came through our general counsel's office. And one of the things that I did is I captured those notes out of Campus Connect and I shared them as part of the records release because they really are subject to FERPA. And then finally, a computer display screen with information about a student and their grades. I don't want to say flipped out, but I was getting ready for this presentation this morning and preparing my notes, and I got up from my desk for a bit and I forgot to lock my computer. No one was in the office and it wasn't a big deal, but and I had no student information up anyways. But when you're working, you need to be aware that if you're, even when I'm at home, if I work at home and I happen to go into our PeopleSoft instance, and I browse to say add or update a person where you have social security number or really any screen with student information, I'm very careful about locking my computer if I have to get up and, you know, I want to get a drink or whatever, because I mean, you never know what could happen. I go to worst case scenarios myself, like someone could break into my house and take my laptop and then I'll have access to all this information. Kind of unlikely, but still, certainly if you're in a public place or in an office or in a public facing area in your office where, excuse me, someone keeps calling me. If you're in a public facing area in your office where someone could see your screen, you need to be very cognizant about locking it, maybe even signing out of PeopleSoft if need be, because it could be a huge FERPA violation depending on what you're looking for. I think we're at about the midpoint of the session, so I'm going to turn things over to Chelsea now.
Okay, excellent. So we talked about sort of what is an educational record, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what might not be considered an educational record. Sam already mentioned things like sole possession records that are used as memory aids. The example that I use when I'm speaking with like academic advisors and the like is something like knowing that when I was a kid, I wanted to be a paleontologist. It might be helpful to jog your memory and remember who I am, but not considered part of my educational record, whereas something like my class schedule or GPA would be. Other things that are not considered educational records are going to be university law enforcement records that are specifically used for law enforcement purposes, as well as medical records that are maintained in the course of treatment. In addition, alumni records that do not contain information about the person as a student are not considered part of the educational record. If you wanna, cool. There are a few circumstances when you're not going to need prior consent for the student in order to release information. So these circumstances include cases of legitimate educational interest, which we will talk about in detail. Disclosure to organizations that are conducting studies in order to improve instruction. Accrediting organizations are included, as well as to comply with cases with judicial orders or lawfully issued subpoena. There are also considerations made for cases of health and safety emergencies. And then any request for directory information, as long as the student has not opted out of the disclosure of that information. So one of their rights under FERPA is that they can opt out. As long as a student has not opted out, that's when that sort of, you may release that directory information to a third party asking for it without any notification or prior consent from the student. So let's talk about legitimate educational interests. This is one of those parts of FERPA that has a whole bunch of jargon in it, but the main points of it are that a school official, those of us in this room, virtual room, have a legitimate educational interest if we need to review a record in order to fulfill professional responsibility. It's basically a need to know by those people who are acting in the student's interest, and that's a really that's sort of the bones of it. Essentially, curiosity is not considered a legitimate educational interest. So looking up a student's information for personal reasons or for curiosity does not give you, a legal right to have that information. So if a student or eligible parent requests to review their educational record, like Sam mentioned earlier, the school's not immediately required to slap down a giant file with everything on it that has the student's name on it. The school doesn't have to provide copies unless they're unable to review the student or eligible designee is not able to review them in person. This might be in a case of like a great distance where you can't make an arrangement for the student to go to a partner institution. The school can charge for copies. And then the express written consent is required before releasing any non-directory information to anyone other than the student, unless the requester meets those criteria that we mentioned earlier, such as the legitimate educational interest, health and safety emergency. I did put the actual section of FERPA that covers that, just in case anyone got really curious and wanted to read all of the super awesome jargon-filled information on that in that section of the legislation. So we put together a couple of just some do's and don'ts. Like Sam mentioned earlier, there's a lot of sort of logic in here. So it's just a couple of reminders. This is, many of these are directed towards people that don't necessarily deal with FERPA on an everyday basis. So like I said, it's more helpful reminders than sort of hard and fast rules, although some of them, as we'll talk about, are pretty hard and fast. Returning information or sharing information with students in a secure manner is really important. Developing policies to retain necessary information and only necessary information, because once you decide to retain it, you have to maintain it. So that's a pretty important part. If it's not something that's necessary as part of that student's record, then let's get rid of it. Otherwise, you have to store it somewhere. Dispose of material containing that information in a secure manner. Obviously, needs to be shredded or in a lockbox or things like that. Definitely lock your computer when you step away and maintain privacy when student information is on your screen. These two, like I said, Sam mentioned them earlier, but they're particularly relevant as many of us have spent the last year working from home and may have people around us who are not trained in FERPA. So even if it's an accidental disclosure, it still counts in the eyes of FERPA. So those are pretty timely for now. My list of don'ts is significantly longer. But again, we're going to follow some pretty basic logic on here. Some things to avoid would be disclosing information before authenticating the identity of a person, linking the student's name with non-directory information that could be shared with third parties who might not have consent, including confidential information in recommendations unless the student knows about it, providing lists or files to third parties unless they've been properly vetted, providing individual student schedules to people, and accessing records for personal reasons. Just as a reminder, curiosity does not give you a legal right to know. And then the other items on here, again, are pretty logical, but they're worth mentioning out loud. Don't write down your password, don't use personal external drives or send information with student information to places where you can't guarantee that the person that's viewing it has the right to view it. And now we have a couple of very timely items with regard to FERPA and COVID-19. These are some nuances that had to sort of be explored over the last year. So first one is with regard to technology. FERPA is technology neutral, and like Sam mentioned earlier, an education record can exist in any medium. The one that has popped up, that sort of started popping up right as institutions were transitioning to remote instruction, has to do with meeting platforms. So because FERPA is technology neutral, it means it doesn't matter which platform you use for delivering lectures, advising appointments, or student service. But if a recording of it is maintained, then it can become part of the student's record and would be subject to FERPA if it's shared outside of the class or appointment or with anybody other than the student or students who are present in that recording. Also, though, a student can't use their right to opt out of director information disclosures to avoid participating in classes or preventing school from preventing school officials from identifying them in the class. So if an instructor says your name in your class, and a student has opted out of disclosure of directory information, they can't use that as excuse to say, hey, he violated my FERPA rights. The other big thing that came into play is FERPA with regard to health information. This one really boils down to who is maintaining the records. A easy example of this would be if a campus was requiring a COVID vaccine in order for on-campus attendance. If that information is maintained within the student information system as part of and linked to the student's account, such as the information or the immunization page within PeopleSoft, then it does become part of that student record. If it's maintained by your health department or wellness center or on-campus health facilities, then it remains a health record and not a education record, and then you have HIPAA to deal with, which that's not my thing. So so at this point, we did want to open up if anybody has any specific examples that you've had to navigate tricky FERPA situations, or there's parts of it that you're still unsure of. We said before, there is a lot of jargon, so we are happy to entertain questions. Some of it gets a little bit confusing, but are there any questions?
Keeping an eye on the chat.
I wanted to add a little bit, not to go back to an earlier point that Chelsea made about legitimate educational interest. I think all of us have, in many cases, pretty high level access to student information. And I would say generally, even for yourselves, even if you can view something, doesn't mean you should. So again, don't poke around. Even myself, I have access to a whole lot of things in student information in my UNLV and other systems. I don't go in there to poke around just because. I mean, you just have to kind of think about whether you need something to do your job. So just, yeah, that's idle curiosity. Again, to beat a dead horse is not grounds for claiming legitimate educational interest.
Looks like we have a request to go into more about best practices for email communications.
Okay. Well, I guess I can start. Generally speaking, it really depends on what you're being asked for. I tend to get leery depending on, well, a number of things. What's being asked for? Like, I would never respond to an email that says, hey, can you send me Chelsea's social security number or something like that? But, you know, obvious things like that. But within kind of your institution's domain, or certainly at UNLV, I feel safer communicating information. But even there, I'm going to give you a long-winded answer because I think depending on where the email is coming from, I think there are a lot of different answers. But even within UNLV, I'll get occasionally requests for student information. I will, and there are still a number of people here on campus I don't know. I will often look them up either in Workday or in the our employee directory online to make sure I can ascertain some legitimate reason to have whatever information it is. Sometimes I'll opt for picking up the phone and calling someone. Another thing that I do is what I'd recommend you, well, I think you should be careful in general because I think probably all of us have gotten burned with you know, forwarded emails that are this long and then there's stuff in there. What I will do sometimes is I will delete previous messages and sending a reply because you never know what could be. And actually the kind of funny but not so funny cases I think of are not really FERPA violations, but embarrassing things that have been forwarded to the wrong people. So that's generally a good email practice overall, but I think it could save you in FERPA terms as well. Chelsea, what are some best practices from your perspective?
Primarily, one of the things that we deal with the most with regard to, you know, email communications and how much or how little information to release has to do with alumni that are contacting us, you know, for information on their record. And you are absolutely within your, you know, as the representative of the institution, you can certainly ask additional questions of the student or the individual that's contacting you. So like Sam said, if it's another university official, confirm who they are, look them up in the directory. If it's somebody contacting you and maybe they no longer have access to their, you know, student email because they are an alum who has, you know, stopped attending or has graduated a long time ago, you can ask sort of verification questions. FERPA gives some, the guidance on FERPA does give some suggestions for types of questions that you can ask, and generally are related to this person as a student. So first semester of attendance, when did you graduate? What was your degree in? What was a class that you took? You know, and what term did you take it in? Things like that, in addition to like confirm your first and last name, you know, and things like that. So if you are, you know, if there is a question, you can take that extra step before giving that information and putting it in an email to verify and validate that person's identity first. Obviously, if it is in fact the student, then they have a right to have that information. And so you can do it, but you don't have to just give it to them just because they said they're the student. You can verify that first.
Another thing I wanted to add, sort of piggyback on the email topic, is be extra careful with attachments, because one of the things that I deal with on the investigation side often concerns like my professor sent the wrong thing to the wrong student or something. I mean, they end up not being huge violations, and I as part of cases like that, I'll notify the person whose email or information was disclosed, and it's often not a big deal. But you can imagine sending the wrong attachment with, say, a social security number or a credit card number or whatever to the wrong person. A lot of damage could happen there. So check and double check those attachments before you send them.
Awesome, thank you. We've got another question about should our police departments be given access to student files to navigate to find student information? Not sure if there's a word missing, but should police departments be given access to student files?
I think that really depends on what the police department needs. Certainly, there are exemptions or exceptions under FERPA for health and safety emergencies, and that's been determined by whatever protocols you have in place. Then certainly there is a case to be made. But I would, I mean, it's kind of a cop out, but I think it depends. I mean, certainly you wouldn't want to just give them carte blanche to look up student information. But if there is sort of a, urgent need, then I think there is a case to be made. Like if they need to know if such and such person is in class at a certain time, that there could be a case to be made in that case.
All right, and then we have another one. If a student has given a professor a written release form to release quiz grades, test grades, where is that written release stored? With the professor or with the office of the registrar?
Either or is fine. The bottom line is it's all kind of part of the education record. I mean, typically release forms, I'd err on the side of keeping them in a central office like the registrar's office. That's kind of an unusual. I've not had that at UNLV, certainly. Chelsea, I don't know if it's come up for you before, but
The one that I've seen is sort of like a general release form for instructors who are asked to write letters of recommendation. And usually that will contain, basically it's sort of a blanket form that is housed in those cases, usually with the department that the instructor is employed by. And essentially it'll say something along the lines of, like, as a student, you can put my stuff, you can say I got straight A's in your class, or, in that recommendation, as part of that recommendation letter. And it's more, to be honest, it's more of a sort of, a CYA sort of document. But it is something that, once, like I said before, once you keep it, you have to maintain it. But that one's it doesn't come up quite as often. So.
Yeah. And the bottom line is it becomes kind of an institutional matter. So if the student came back and said, why did Professor Smith release my test scores? I mean, we have to be able to locate that release. And if Professor Smith is retired and living in, in a houseboat somewhere, and we can't get a hold of him with his files, then, we may have a problem.
Okay, we've got another one. These are great questions. Keep them coming. We have about 12 minutes left in the session. In regard to a deceased student, what proof do we need that the student is deceased before releasing information? For example, a student attended the institution 30 or 40 years ago. Their child called to confirm their degree and year to include it in the obituary.
Well, if it's just degree and year, I mean, that could be fine under kind of a directory information type of thing. So I don't know that you need to prove death. I mean, if they want, I haven't dealt with this so much at UNLV, mainly because we're such a young institution, but at my last institution was much older, and we would occasionally, someone wants to look up their education records of their great grandma, or whatever it was. And what we would often do in a case like that is ask for proof of death, like a death certificate. We would ask for at that institution, ask for authorization from the executor of that person's estate or some other blood connection. I mean, I couldn't, if I'm an outside person, I couldn't go and say, I want to look up Mabel Brown's record from 1901 or something, just for the heck of it. So there could be different protocols, and it depends on what is being asked from the education record of the deceased person.
Few times that it's happened at UNLV, we've been, we've asked for something like a death certificate, and then that also has been forwarded to the appropriate office so that the student's record can be coded, because we have a code that says that the person is deceased, and so then that's on there for the future. If somebody were to come back later, then obviously we don't have to ask for that death certificate again, because it's clearly labeled in the system that says, so that we know. But it also, like Sam said, depends on the type of information asked. We designate degree earned and the year that it was conferred as directory information. So as long as it doesn't set off that alarm bell in your gut, then that's fine to be able to release with or without that confirmation.
Okay, I've gotten a question about, I'm not sure if you all are able to see the chat or not, but a passage wanting, and this person would like a little bit more clarification on it. It says, however, although the rights under FERPA have now transferred to the student, a school may disclose information from an eligible student's education records to the parents of the student without the student's consent if the student is a dependent for tax purposes. Neither the age of the student nor the parent's status as a custodial parent is relevant. If a student is claimed as a dependent by either parent for tax purposes, then either parent may have access under this provision.
Well, may would be the operative word there again. I have actually an institution I attended as a student. I did work there part-time, I guess, but I attended as a student. They would invoke that provision essentially for release under FERPA if someone was claimed as a dependent. At UNLV, if you attend, the FERPA rights are yours.
I can think of one for sure situation when a parent was essentially, demanding information, the type, and there is that little out in FERPA. It says regardless of age, but we do have that sort of out for in cases of true financial dependence. And in that case, what the legislation says that we need to ask for is that actual proof that the student was claimed as dependent for tax purposes. So we would ask for the tax return. The situation that happened in this particular case, we kind of pushed back on it because the parent provided us with an amended tax return, but earlier in that semester, the student had filed for a reclassification of their residency as an independent student, and provided us tax returns at that point showing that they were not claimed as a dependent. So it was really a case of the parent was just trying to get a lot of extra information, in which case we contacted the student and let them know and said, hey, if you want, you can give this information. You can also provide a release, a formal FERPA third-party release for this information for your parent. But based off of the documentation that we have, there's conflicting information. And so we're exercising our may right.
All right, next one. A student is a 16-year-old attending our institution and a parent wants to know their student's GPA. What types of documents are needed from the parent and or student to release information?
The easiest one would be that third-party release from the student. Different schools and universities might do them differently. Ours is at UNLV, it's electronic, so the student would log into their student portal and they can actually add and remove their release, which we can see across the university, and they can designate which parts of their record are being released. So if I put on my parent, I can actually designate only 1 or 2 or 3 parts. It'll cover stuff like academic advising information, academic records, which obviously is my transcript and my enrollment history, financial information, cashiering information, housing information. So the student actually would check off which of those things they wanted to release, and then put it there. We used to have a paper form. It still had the different, those different classifications as well. So if the student was 16 and their parent wanted to know their information, the first thing, the easiest way to do it is the student would put a third-party release for academic records and put their parent's name. Once we've verified that and validated that parent's identity, then we can say, okay, your student has a 4.0.
It's a very convenient mod. I was actually helping a student at the front counter, well, actually a parent, and He ended up calling, and he had the student had no one designated as a third party, and but his dad called his kid while he was at work, and they did it on the spot, and I was able to help the dad out, just by asking for the dad's driver's license to confirm who he was. But that's, I think, a quick way around it if you're kind of in the heat of something and you need to respond right away.
All right, we've got about 4 more minutes left. So another question we got, does FERPA allow us to share data with a school district if it concerns dual enrollment records, where the student is still in high school but is taking college classes for dual credit?
Under the umbrella of legitimate educational interest. Also, interestingly enough, if you share information with the school district and the student is dual enrolled as a high school student, their high school record, the FERPA rights lie with the parent as a high school record. So technically, if you give the information to the school, and then the school then can give it to the parent, regardless of whether or not the student has a third-party release with the post-secondary institution. That's the sort of other way around. If you have a student that's under 18 and their parent wants information, that's their other loophole.
All right, any last minute questions? All right, here's one. Is passing around a sign-in sheet for students to write down their name and NSHE ID number a FERPA violation? If so, why?
That is an excellent question. Typically, well, NSHE ID is not considered directory information, so I think that disclosing it in disclosing in a case like that could be, as you know, even if a student has directory non-release on file, that doesn't entitle them to somehow be hidden in class, either virtually or in person, because practically it's not doable. Certainly sending around a piece of paper with names on it shouldn't be an issue, because that's directory information, of course, and students are all there anyways. But I would not, in my judgment, consider including the NSHE ID as a good idea in a case like that. Maybe just the name would be better.
I've seen cases where if you do want to have some kind of additional identifying information on that sort of a sign-in sheet, my recommendation would be to use something that is on that directory side of the list of information. So when I've done sessions for like enrollment sessions for students, we usually go with with a name and then their university email address instead, because email address is technically on the directory side, and we can that's one that we can decide whether or not to disclose or not, and so that's usually a little bit of a safer option.
All right, we've got 1 minute left and one more question. So are registrations / signups for events for COVID contact tracing purposes considered a part of the student record?
It's a good question. So the people who are signing up are students, right? Oh yes, okay. Well, it's student information. It's maintained by the institution. Presumably, it's shared. So yes.
Perfect. Right on time.
Brilliant.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Sam and Chelsea for presenting today and sharing all this awesome information with us. I did put the website for the summit in the chat, so you can click on it. Go ahead and navigate back to that. Our next session will be starting at 10:30. Okay. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Have a good weekend.